And I will find the video and I'm going to start a watch party there, and our technical team is on the ball. I see the video has begun. So I'm going to share the video to my page, and then I'm going to start a live watch party. Learning all sorts of wonderful tricks during the lockdown, of course, of how we can use technology to connect with each other and to keep these very important conversations going. So I've shared the video, the live video from the Salam Media page where you can watch it. But I'm also going to start a watch party on my Facebook page. So if you prefer to join the watch party there, you can. But remember, it's also available on the Salam Media page and all of the platforms, and that's working perfectly well. Fantastic. Let's get the show on the road. Okay, today we're in conversation with Sue Kravitz, and we're talking about what do we do about all of the abandoned babies and children in South Africa during COVID-19 and beyond. We have a very serious crisis, and she'll be unpacking that with us. And then in the second half of the show, we're speaking with Lawson Naidu about what impact independent political candidates can make to our democracy. Okay, so the studio is telling me that my video is freezing. I'm not sure why, but let's begin the show. I'm going to ask Shazia to please bring Sue Kravitz onto camera for us so we can start the conversation today. Hello, Sue Kravitz, and welcome to the People's Voice.
Hi, nice to be with you this afternoon.
Wonderful to have you on. Let me tell you about Sue so we have some context. Sue Kravitz is a social worker in the field of adoption for 31 years. She's a co-founder of Impilo Child Protection and Adoption Services, focusing on placing children in a family environment as soon as possible after removal. She's also the co-founder and current vice chair of the National Adoption Coalition South Africa. Currently, Impilo, like many organizations working with children, face serious challenges due to children being abandoned under the COVID-19 lockdown. So let's start here. Tell us very briefly about the history and the vision of Impilo, and of course, what are its successes and challenges?
So our organization was started in 2003. At that time, we were in the middle of the HIV pandemic. And there were many, many children who were being abandoned, particularly in hospitals. We had cases of children sitting in hospitals for sometimes 2 years. So a colleague and I felt that we could have an impact. We felt that we would be able to get these children out of hospitals and into families. So our vision is to create families, to get children into a family situation as early as possible after they are taken out of a family situation for whatever the reason is. And we have been fairly successful, I believe, and we've placed children back with their families, their biological parents, extended families, sometimes in foster care with aunts and uncles and grannies. And then we also do adoption. Remember, because of the fact that we have adoption accreditation, we are often referred abandoned children or children whose mothers have considered adoption.
What sort of challenges do you face, Sue? I mean, it's a very fulfilling space of work, absolutely, but certainly very challenging as well. Can you tell us about those?
Yes, it is challenging. I've been doing this for 31 years and it never seems to get easier. It shouldn't be easier. You are making recommendations to the court about the future of a child's life. So you have to take this work very seriously, and I personally consider it to be a privilege. But the challenges come in that we are faced with many, many hurdles to overcome in the process of an adoption. Whilst we recognize and acknowledge that these are essential checks and balances, we also feel that the system is slow and sometimes forgets that there's a child at the end of this process that we should be making decisions for a little bit more quickly.
And what's ironic about that is that the test for our children is what is in the best interests of children. And of course, the legal prescript is justice delayed is justice denied. So these children that are stuck in the system have justice denied to them from a little age, and they grow up with that. But we're going to get more into that. So 3,500 babies abandoned in South Africa annually. And that's only the living ones, right? The ones that survive. We know over 80% of babies who die are because they're being abandoned, and that's the South African Medical Research Council that's told us that. But why are children abandoned? Tell us about some of the causes and the reasons you've come across.
Okay, so I just want to mention that 3,500 figure is actually from 2010, and there are no official statistics at the moment. So that is in itself a problem. So
can I just ask why there are no statistics since 2010?
Okay, so there is a system in place, but it doesn't produce figures regularly or at all at the moment. The Department of Social Development do have a system for reporting, but we haven't had stats out of that system since 2010. And I think that we should join hands with the department to find a better way of recording these. I would think that the technology that's available today, we could set up some kind of a system that would give us more current. Because if we don't know what we're dealing with, we can't help, and we can't direct services. So that's important. The other issue of the babies that don't survive, that is a big problem of mothers who are aborting late in their pregnancies. They are also getting backstreet abortions. They still find it difficult to seek the help of the system. And many babies are found, and there has been research done, and a lot of these babies are unfortunately born breathing, and then they die once they're abandoned. So that is very tragic indeed. So your question was, why abandonment? Why abandonment? It's a difficult question. So I think it's desperation, that mothers feel at that point completely helpless and abandoned. I've worked with many, many mothers over many years, and I've never found a mother who really did this out of malice. It was a desperation act. They simply do not know what to do to get help. So that is one of the reasons. All the reasons that we are struggling with, there's unemployment, there's poverty, there's lack of housing, lack of education. A lot of foreign mothers who come into the country and then are completely alone. There's gender-based violence. A lot of these women have been raped, and that's quite common, we find. And it's still a criminal offense in South Africa to abandon a child. So we have soft and hard abandonment. So a hard abandonment would be when a child is left, say, in a rubbish dump or something like that, where the chances of survival are decreased. And then you get soft abandonment, where children are for some or other reason left in hospital. Perhaps they're not well, or they have to be there, or the mother says she'll come back, and they disappear. So these two figures add up considerably. And one has to think about that poor mother who leaves her child on a rubbish dump, how absolutely desperate and alone she must feel at that point.
I want to say though, Sue, I think we're doing something wrong. I mean, and I don't mean Impilo or you, I mean we as society, where a parent feels that the only choice they have is to dump this child that they cannot look after because of the reasons that you've mentioned. And certainly a lot more work needs to be done by civil society working together with you. So what happens when these babies are abandoned on the street at SAPS or brought into an NPO? Very briefly, what's the process?
So generally speaking, the police or whoever finds the baby would go to the police, and the police most often take them to a hospital to be checked out, particularly the newborns. If it's an older child, they might approach various organizations to take the child in places of safety, and there are various setups. And then the Child Protection Organization would start a process of opening what we call a children's court inquiry and officially placing the child in the system, which is also very important. And they would be placed in safe care, temporary safe care, while investigations are being done.
All right, your comments and questions for Sue Kravitz. We're talking about our babies being abandoned in South Africa. It's an absolute crisis and it has very serious impacts. So what it is that needs to be done. I want to ask one more question before we go to a clip that we're going to play in a moment. So what kind of emotional impact may be experienced by children who are abandoned, who grow up to realize and understand that I was abandoned? Nobody loved me. Nobody fostered me. Nobody adopted me. I've lived my whole life in this place. What's wrong with me? You talk about the emotional impact, Sue.
Well, I think that's the very reason why we shouldn't let children grow up in children's homes, and that they belong in families. Even if it's adopted families, they need to feel loved. Obviously, the fact that you are abandoned, that you feel nobody loved or cared for you is traumatic, and many of the children have to be helped to work through this. It's such a and it's internalized often by the children as well. I wasn't good enough, my mother didn't want me, she threw me away, etc. And that is where you need psychological help. These children are often left with not only emotional problems, but often other problems such as health issues, learning disabilities are quite common as well. So the families that take these children in must be prepared and assisted to seek help as early as possible. And it's a difficult process because there's nobody to answer your questions. Where do you start to find out who or where you came from when you were left outside in at a rubbish dump? And it's very hard to come to terms with that kind of information or lack of information.
Absolutely agree with you. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll be screening a clip from Carte Blanche talking about the crisis in child abandonment and adoption, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back after this quick break.
Listen to something fresh. Listen to Salam Media, your humanitarian broadcaster.
You may be out there in the working space building your future. Perhaps you are as comfortable on the sports field as you are in the boardroom, or hard at work being the best student possible. You could be spending most of your time at home grooming the leaders of tomorrow. Either way, you need to feel confident, strong, and comfortable. Eternity Sanitary Pads, now available at a store close to you.
يا نور يا محكم يا تنزيل لمحمد
23 years of revelation.
رب العرش دليل.
From the Ba in Bismillah to the Sin in Nas with Ustada Zahira Karim of MOHAMED, Wednesday between 8 and 9 p.m. exclusively to Salam Media. starting 1st July 2020. This broadcast will be available on our online and satellite frequency, as well as our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Salon Media, this is the future.
Rejuvenating media day by day. This is Salam Media.
Makosi is a 5-year-old orphan growing up in a children's home. She's one of millions of South Africa's children whose stories are steeped in tragedy. One day, she hopes to be with a family of her own. How many successful adoptions have you had? 1. And that one, you said the department wasn't very helpful. For 17 years, Asnath Tefo has run an early child development center in Midrand. Some of the children in her care are now matriculating, having spent most of their lives at this home.
When we started, it was a place of safety, meaning the kids were not supposed to be here for more than 6 months. Some of the kids were even at some point forgotten by the social workers. When you phone to say, are you remembering that these kids are still here? They would literally say they don't remember them.
There are an estimated 3 million orphaned or abandoned children in South Africa, with at least 1.2 million of them in potential need of adoption. Nationally, adoption figures have dropped substantially over the years, from 2,500 annually to 1,165 in 2016. And in KwaZulu-Natal, the province with the most orphaned and abandoned children, there have only been 174 adoptions in the last 6 years.
Well, as you've seen in that clip from Carte Blanche, we have a serious problem. 3 million orphaned or abandoned children in South Africa, yet in 2018, in KwaZulu-Natal alone, just 174 babies were adopted in 6 years. I believe in 2016, it was just 8 babies that were adopted. So we've watched that clip, Sue, and it's just a horrific nightmare, and I really don't know how you deal with this. But what's happened since this clip, Sue? Has there been any progress whatsoever?
There has been some progress, particularly in KZN, where the Centre for Child Law from the University of Pretoria acted on behalf of the National Adoption Coalition against the Department of Social Development in KZN, because they were not issuing the letters of recommendation which are required for an adoption. And that we won that case. So there has been some movement. So I want to say that the numbers have dropped even further. I think the statistics for last year were around 1,200 adoptions done in the whole country, which is an absolute indictment when we look at the numbers of just abandoned children, never mind the children where the mothers are consenting, etc. So I think that there are serious blockages in the system that make it a very tiresome and difficult process. As I said, there are steps that one has to go through to prepare a child, they are all in terms of the Act and are required. And then there are steps that are administrative, where various processes have to be completed by the Department of Social Development and then the courts. There are delays at courts, and there are major delays at the Departments of Social Development, who are also overwhelmed and overworked. And we constantly are looking at ways to move these processes along. It is a crime that these children are sitting in a home. A child that, and the Act actually says, a child that abandoned should be treated as a priority to be adopted. So, we shouldn't be talking about a year, 18 months, 2 years to finalize adoptions. We should be talking about 4 or 5 months. And we fortunately have many South Africans now coming forward to adopt. In my organization, we've been overwhelmed by the inquiries, which is so encouraging. But the process... You know what
I find strange about that, Sue? I just want to pause. Is that in the rest of that carte blanche expose, The official from the department that was interviewed said there's no demand for adoption. But what you're telling me from your perspective as an organization is that there is a demand. Maybe the parents just give up because all of the bureaucracy that's involved and the false allegations as well.
I think that there's several points there. A lot of people are put off because they see it as a difficult, expensive process, which we'll discuss further on. But, you know, there are unfortunately more children than there are parents. But we have seen a significant increase in South Africans of all races coming forward to adopt. So we as social workers are quite overwhelmed by the number of cases, and the process of screening is complex. And why is it complex and thorough? Because we have to make a recommendation about a child's future. We can't rush these processes. And then I'll give you an example. There is a thing called a sexual offences clearance certificate, which has to be obtained. There's months and months of backlog, and without those documents, you can't move. You can't move a child. You can't place a child with somebody. So there are so many procedures in adoption. Yes, it's important to have checks and balances, but they are causing these children serious delays.
Absolutely agree with you. I don't know, at some point, whether it might be a good idea for all of the organizations to get together in a class action, along with these babies that are sitting and waiting for loving homes, and just take it to court to make things happen, because we've seen inevitably that's the only thing that actually works. So how difficult is it to foster or adopt a child in South Africa in terms of the process and the cost? And we've got about 8 minutes to go and 4 more questions.
Okay, I'll be quick. Fostering is different to adoption. Fostering is when a child's placed with you pending reunification, hopefully with the parents. And that there are no fees involved in fostering, and it's not a particularly cumbersome process. Adoption is a little bit more of a cumbersome process, and there may be costs involved. It depends on who you're working through. There are regulations around the fees, so each organization can be approached regarding the costs, and they are always negotiable.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, and of course, if people want more information, they can research it online and look for accredited adoption organizations as well. So under the C19 lockdown, do you have any idea how many babies have been abandoned in Johannesburg, where you're based, and in South Africa, and why? Why are they abandoned under lockdown?
So unfortunately, we don't have any official figures, as I've said, but we are seeing a steep incline. I think, you know, now that it's been a longer period, around about a 50%. Why are we seeing more? Well, I think people are they're hungry. You know, you're 16-year-old, you're years old, you're pregnant, you don't want to tell your parents. There's a mother who can't feed her family. So I think that unfortunately, we are going to see an increase, which is linked to the economic situation as well, directly.
Sure. When unemployment is rocketing, we've always had that problem. But of course, now through the lockdown, it's exacerbated. More babies will be abandoned or even killed as a result of that. So what must happen? What must happen in these circumstances?
I think we have to make it easier for women to come forward and to get the help. We have to be open to not making judgments about them. And you know, there are some of these baby safes where mothers leave their children, and that again is a desperate act. But it's really important that we don't make them feel criminalized by thinking about this, and really services to assist them, because they don't necessarily have to abandon their child if one can assist them to look at other alternatives.
And of course, if poverty was not such an issue, and if unemployment wasn't such a crisis, then we wouldn't be facing this kind of situation. You know, this one is a little bit of a curveball, Sue, but do you know how South Africa compares to other countries in terms of abandoned babies? How do we compare, maybe on the African continent or just globally?
So, it waxes and wanes depending on what's going on economically and politically. We know that Ethiopia has high numbers, but South Africa certainly has particularly high numbers. There was, in Russia, there used to be more of a problem. I think that's no longer such an issue. But we are not doing well. We really have way too many children that are abandoned. It
certainly should be at the top, and it should be at the top of our country's agenda. I mean, what more important cause is there than our children? So how do organizations like Impilo survive running operations with demand increasing? How are you doing it?
It's difficult, and we've had to do a lot of fundraising and appealing for all the help that we can get, whether it's in kind or financially. But we have to pay our social workers. We have to, we're managing to work full time under lockdown, and we are offering all our services. But funds are essential. So, people should look for an organization if it's closer to them or wherever they feel. But we need donations. We need to pay the lights and water and the telephone and our staff as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Month-to-month survival. Imagine how stressful that is in the lives of these little babies that depend on you. So how can people get involved to support the work of Impilo and, of course, other child service organizations as well? But how can they get involved to support you? How can they contact you? How can they reach you?
So we have a website, impilo.org.za, and we have a Facebook page as well, Impilo Child Protection and Adoption. And we're quite active on Facebook as well.
All right, so reach out to Impilo via their email, the website, and on Facebook, and get involved. Cash, kind, support, volunteer, whatever it takes to make the lives of these children and the lives of these wonderful organizations doing this work that really is thankless and complicated a little bit easier. But at the same time, we need to advocate. We need to make our voices heard with the Department of Social Development, with government, with Parliament, with the President, to make sure that children are at the top of the agenda. Sue Kravitz, thank you very much for the work that you do for our children and for spending some time with us today on The People's Voice.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. So we've been in conversation with Sue Kravitz there from Impilo. We have a serious problem with our children, and it's an explosion waiting to happen because unwanted children manifest that grief and anxiety and depression as they grow older in different ways, including depression, including suicide, including violence. And then we sit and wonder, why do we have these problems in our country? We need to go to the roots. After the break, we'll be in conversation with Lawson Naidu, talking about the impact of independent political candidates on our democracy. Keep it locked in. The People's Voice on Salam Media.
It's a new beginning. It's a new era. Salam Media, humanitarian journalism.
From the townships of South Africa, the refugee camps in Syria, or orphanages in Yemen, the eyes of the needy speak volumes with just one glare. We know what it's like to be at ground zero, with food essentials, clothing and blankets, fresh water portal trucks, and even on-site navigators. We use every cent to better their tomorrow. Become part of our journey to bring relief to all. Go to www.ashrafulaid.org or call us on 011-809-8181. Ashraful Aid, under the auspices of Maulana Suhail Wadi.
Osman's Taj Mahal Spice and Rice. For over 80 years, Osman's Taj Mahal have been perfecting the art of the perfect blend of spices, pure, aromatic, and well-seasoned. Spices to tantalize your taste buds. From creative cuisines to gastronomical gourmet goodies, from exotic odors to traditional dishes, Osman's Taj Mahal have remained synonymous with quality spices and condiments. Taj Mahal rice, beans, and lentils. Try our range of chili bite mixes, rose and ilachi syrup, our quick and easy biryani pack, and our traditional range of spice blends. Osman's Taj Mahal. There is no substitute for quality.
Listen to something fresh. Listen to Salam Media.
Welcome back to The People's Voice with SHABNAM, PALESA, MOHAMED on Salam Media. In the second half of our show today, we're in conversation with Lawson Naidu, and our topic, what impact can independent political candidates make in our democracy? Let's bring Lawson into studio so I can introduce him. Lawson Naidu, welcome to The People's Voice.
Thank you very much for having me on this afternoon.
Fantastic. Let's give the people out there some context into Lawson Naidu. He's the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, committed to the principles of progressive constitutionalism, democracy, and the rule of law. He holds this position from 2010. He's also worked as a strategic political consultant, focusing on anti-corruption and good governance. He's also a regular media commentator on constitutional and legal issues. So we're looking forward to a stimulating discussion with you, Lawson, today. No pressure, but I know you're quite used to it. Now, 2 weeks ago, the Constitutional Court ruled that the Electoral Act is unconstitutional as it excludes independent candidates from elections, something that's so obvious. Take us through the appeal arguments by the New Nation movement. We know that initially they were declined the relief that they sought, and they had to take it on appeal. What were those arguments made, Lawson?
Well, good afternoon, Shabnam, and thank you very much again. So yes, as you rightly say, this was a matter that was initially heard in the Western Cape High Court in early last year, 2019, before the 2019 general election. And the application was dismissed in the Western Cape High Court, and they sought leave to appeal directly to the Constitutional Court, which was granted, and then the matter was ultimately argued before the court in August of last year. And essentially, the New Nation movement argued that the Electoral Act was unconstitutional because it did not provide an opportunity for individuals, for so-called independent candidates, to stand as candidates in national and provincial elections, and that this was a violation of their constitutional rights, the right to participate in elections that's spelled out in Section 19, subsection 3 of the Constitution, as well as, and this was the interesting aspect, a violation of the right to freedom of association. And right. They argued that the current Electoral Act was forcing people to join political parties if they want to stand for election to public office, and that this was a negation of that right by being forced to do something that it runs counter to the notion of freedom of association. And ultimately, the court in the Constitutional Court agreed with them on both those counts, and therefore said that the Electoral Act is unconstitutional to the extent that it doesn't make provision for independent candidates to contest national and provincial elections.
You know what I found strange, Lawson, is that Judge Siraj Desai in the Western Cape's question to the applicants was, why don't you join a political party? I think he completely missed the point. But of course, Judge Madlanga took it in a very different direction. So what I want to do is watch the New Nation movement react to the judgment on ENCA. And when we come back, I want to talk about Judge Madlanga's rationale and the significance of this groundbreaking judgment. Let's take a look.
joined by the New Nation movement, which of course has been at the forefront of fighting this. Just take us through your reactions to the judgment today.
I think from about the 10th minute, I realized already. From there, I could see that the judge is going to walk all over, the respondents. It was absolutely clear that this judgment was going to go our way, and so therefore we are ecstatic and excited, not for ourselves, because finally it is proven that an individual in this country who is an adult individual has the right to stand, and to be chosen and to be elected into political office. It was just unthinkable that the Electoral Act would bar adult individuals, from holding political office.
There were clearly celebrations from many of you who were behind this particular court bid. And the question then is, why is it important for South Africans out there to take this as a positive moving forward in our democratic society, as far as you guys understand?
South Africans has been given some of the weakest and the most corrupt leaders up to this point. And for that reason, this is critical, that democracy ultimately wins, because now finally individuals in this country will have an opportunity to stand and to keep those that they have elected accountable. These guys that we currently have in parliament and in political offices all across the land, these guys are simply a law unto themselves. They are not accountable to the people, and this is what this judgment does. It brings accountability back, and it gives democracy, the heads up. We will never be, under the mess that we are currently in. Finally, we have an opportunity to rid South Africa of incompetence and corruption.
Us already feel. Okay, so he was talking about accountability, he's talking about corruption, he's talking about competence, very passionately, obviously very happy with that judgment. But Lawson, let's talk about the rationale of Judge Madlanka. He said some very profound statements, of course, and what's the significance of this judgment?
Well, the significance is that it's going to fundamentally alter the electoral system that we've grown accustomed to over the last 26 years, from the very first democratic elections in 1994. We've used this very simple electoral system, which is a closed list proportional representation system, which means that parties submit lists of candidates to the Electoral Commission. When we go to vote, we vote for political parties, and then our votes are tallied, and the allocation of seats either in the National Assembly or provincial legislatures is made basically on the basis of the proportion of votes that each party gets. Now, the benefits of this system, and I do think we need to emphasize that, is that it is inclusive. It's very simple, and I think its inclusivity is demonstrated by the fact that we currently have 17 different political parties represented in the National Assembly. And I think that system, because it doesn't have a threshold, so every single vote counts, and therefore small parties comprised of one or two people, can win seats in national and provincial legislatures. So this judgment is going to mean that we're going to have to amend that system and perhaps look at some sort of constituency-based aspect to our electoral system in order to facilitate the participation of these independent candidates at a constituency level.
Absolutely agree with you. So, Lawson, it brings into focus the constitutional impact of or on our hitherto limited freedom of choice in previous elections. Certainly, there are questions to be raised as to how constitutional, in the light of this judgment, how constitutional were those elections when we didn't have the freedom of choice and association to go the way that we're going now? What are your thoughts?
Well, look, I think, as I've just said, I think we've had a vast array of choices. In the last election, I think on the ballot paper for the National Assembly, we had 48 different political parties seeking our votes and our support. So I don't think we've been short of options in that regard. 17 of those 48, as I said, have made it into the National Assembly. So I don't think we've been starved of choice necessarily. And many of those parties have effectively been one man or one woman enterprises where, it's relatively simple in South Africa to establish and register a political party and to contest elections as a small political party. And many people have taken advantage of that. I think the word of caution that I would want to throw out there is that I don't think that we should see this as a panacea for all of the problems in South African society, that it's suddenly going to stop corruption from happening, that it's suddenly going to make elected representatives more accountable. There's no evidence to suggest that independent candidates are likely to be more accountable or less corrupt than any other politician. Right. So I think, for people to suddenly suggest that because we have this opportunity to elect independents or individual candidates, we're going to deal with accountability and corruption, I think that's very naive.
It's a very, very long haul. Lawson, 2 years, the judgment gave Parliament 2 years to remedy the defect in the Electoral Act, and of course to include a very important recall clause where people have a right to recall a candidate that's not performing or that is incompetent or corrupt, etc. But we've got local elections coming up in 2021. So why is there no emergency? Why does it have to take 2 years to remedy the defects and include a recall clause?
Well, let me start, Shabnam, with the issue of the recall clause. There's no compulsion on Parliament to incorporate a recall clause in the Electoral Act that it's now going to amend. That was not part of the court judgment. It's obviously one of the options that Parliament will need to consider in order to give greater meaning to the notion of a constituency-based member of Parliament and to enhance accountability. But it is by no means a foregone conclusion that that is going to form part of the amendment to the Act. Why 2 years and why no greater sense of urgency? Well, I think 2 years is not a long time. Firstly, let me deal with the issue of next year's local government elections. There's no urgency with regards to that. We already have a mixed electoral system at a local government level, where we elect ward councillors as well as vote on a PR list system. So at a local government level, we can indeed and have in fact voted for individual independent candidates at ward level in local government. And I think that's another warning to our people, is that because we have that system at a local government level, and we quite clearly see that it is not functioning. Some of the worst corruption we see in South Africa is exactly at that local government level, where we have these independent candidates standing and contesting elections, and it's had no impact. So this, I think, really just underscores the point I was making earlier, that this is no silver bullet for that. 2 years, Parliament's going to have to go through an extensive process of public consultation to hear from you and me what we think the correct electoral model should be. They're then going to have to craft a law, pass that law, and even once that is done, and we've agreed on some kind of new electoral system, whether it's a hybrid model comprising proportional representation in constituencies, whether they be single-member constituencies or multi-member constituencies. After all of that is done, the Electoral Commission is then going to have to, in association with the demarcation board, to geographically define those constituencies. The IEC is going to have to put in place a whole new range of operational and technical systems to support that new electoral system. So with that in mind, 2 years is not a very long time. So that's 2 years for Parliament to pass the legislation. We've got 4 years until the next national and provincial elections. So the 4-year horizon in total is not an extraordinary length of time. Can it be done? Absolutely, it can. Because I think if we go back to the 1990s, the Constitutional Assembly drafted a whole new constitution, let alone an electoral system within 2 years. So with the right political will, this can indeed be done.
We're going to take a quick ad break, Lawson, but when we come back, a couple of questions we're going to get into as who are some of the people you would expect to see standing for these independent candidatures, and who do you think should stand? And of course, a very important question of funding. How do they get funded, and what sort of transparency is there with the public, who have a right to know who's funding these political parties and candidates? We'll be right back after the quick break.
Breaking stereotypes, moving boundaries, joining hands. Salam Media.
لا تقل لوحدي أو كيف السبيل.
Humanity sets the agenda.
It's time to act now. COVID-19 is a global pandemic, and we need your help to flatten the curve. Islamic Relief is reaching out to the most vulnerable of our community in South Africa, Yemen and Gaza. 400 Rand can provide a family with a food pack in South Africa, and 500 Rand a hygiene pack in Syria, Yemen and Gaza. With your help, we can save lives across the world. Donate now. Go to www.islamic-relief.org.za.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042-203-1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
It's a new beginning. It's a new era. Salam Media, humanitarian journalism.
Welcome back to the People's Voice on Salam Media. We're in conversation with Lawson Naidu, a constitutional law expert and a media commentator. Now, Lawson, what might we see happen in the next 2 years? Are we expecting a frenzy of independent candidates being sought out, campaigning, some political parties approaching some of them and saying, come on board with us? What are you expecting to happen?
Well, all of those things, Shabnam, all of those things are going to happen in the next few years. I think, it's difficult to really say until we know exactly what model the Parliament adopts for our electoral system, whether it's going to be a constituency system, what those constituencies will look like, whether it's going to be a single member constituency or not. I certainly think that this judgment is a step forward for democracy in South Africa. I think we need to change the electoral system. For me, primarily because we need to remove some of the power that exists at the moment in the hands of the bosses of political parties who really dominate proceedings and dictate how our elected representatives behave in those legislatures. And in order to reduce the power of those political parties, I think this step towards electoral reform is long overdue. But the devil is going to be in the detail. The kind of electoral system that we put in place, is it really going to make it possible for every adult citizen in South Africa to consider standing for election? And as you say, money is going to play a big role in that, because we know that it is a very expensive business, not just in South Africa, but across the world, to contest elections. In South Africa, we've seen political parties spend hundreds of millions of rands on election campaigns. So however well-meaning an individual candidate might be, they're not going to be able to compete at the same level as political parties. So I don't expect to see a huge number of independent candidates being elected to the National Assembly in the next elections in 4 years' time. I think they will certainly add to the discourse in the campaign phase, and hopefully will have some impact in terms of tempering political parties, and perhaps making political parties look a lot more closely at the caliber and the integrity of the candidates that they themselves put on their electoral lists. So, there's going to be integrity. I think both of those are critical factors.
Absolutely agree. Lawson, predictions. Who do you think is going to stand as an independent candidate? And just as a quick offshoot to that, who do you think should? I mean, are we going to see Mumusi Maimane? Who are we going to see in your, I mean, you've been at this a long time, so you can see what's coming on the horizon.
Well, I'm not so sure. It's not always that clear, Shabnam. Look, I think some of the sort of more obvious candidates are the likes of Musi Maimane, perhaps Herman Mashaba, another former member of the Democratic Alliance. And I think this is the kind of thing that we've seen even at a local government level. Many of the independent candidates, people who stand as individuals, are former members of political parties, disaffected members of political parties. So it really isn't, the sort of truly independent candidates, if I can put it like that are going to put up their hands and come forward. And to be able to win support, you're going to have some kind of public profile and stature. You're going to need to be able to attract funding in order to run that campaign. So it's people who are better off, who are better known, people who are professionals who are going to be able to do that. And again, it very much depends on the kind of electoral system and what kind of support one can garner to get a seat in parliament. So to give you as an example, in the current system, the Al Jamaa party has one seat in the National Assembly. And they got that seat having won just over 31,000 votes. Now that's 31,000 votes spread across the whole country. Yes, it might have been largely concentrated in one area or two, but that's, they got those votes from across the country. Now, if you put an individual candidate in the same context, that's how difficult the hurdle is to climb in order to win a seat in parliament. So I think the talk is easy to say that this suddenly opens the door and, we're going to have a number of these independent candidates. I don't think it's going to be that easy. It's going to be a difficult road. We're going to have to get used to this new system of electoral politics. And as I say, as we've seen at a local government level, that change doesn't happen quickly. Parties still dominate, even at a local government level.
The last time I checked, it was about 500,000 to even register a political party. That's apart from the campaigning costs, etc., etc., etc. And what we don't want to see is a recycling of politicians from other political parties now standing as candidates, as independent candidates. What I'd like to see is members of civil society. We've got a strong and robust civil society in our country. That's the people I'd like to see. And when this judgment was made on the 11th of June, some of the names that I saw, one of them pops up in mind because it came up quite a lot, was Imtiaz Suleiman. He's well respected. He has a track record, and I think people would support him, but we'll see. I don't think he's inclined towards politics. But there could be others like him in civil society that we know are experts in their field. They're passionate about what it is that they do, and they're not just politicking. What are your thoughts?
Well, look, I have the utmost respect for someone like Imtiaz Suleiman. I think, they're doing an amazing job. But I think it would be a mistake for us to simply think that because somebody is doing such a fantastic job in one area of public life, that they would be suited to a position as a politician or as a member of parliament. It then would detract from the strength of that civil society. And I think we need to maintain the strength of civil society, because at the end of the day, whoever is elected into public office, whether they come from political parties, from communities, from religious bodies, or wherever they may come from, civil society still has a very important role to exercise oversight over those people. So I think if we simply say that, people that are prominent in civil society should now begin to contest elections and go into parliament, I think that would be a mistake, because we should not weaken the civil society sector as part of this. People who have political ambition and want to go and work in a legislative assembly should do so. But I think there may be some people in civil society who see this as an opportunity, but I don't see it happening on a large scale.
It's going to be a very, very interesting balance in the next 2 years and beyond. Lawson, let's talk about the Constitution and, of course, vis-a-vis the Freedom Charter. In an interview with Professor Sats Cooper on The People's Voice earlier this year, what he said to us was that representative democracy was not intended to be permanent. And I was surprised because I think my memory failed me. I didn't remember all of these discussions that had happened back then. We sort of just accepted it as this is the way it is and this is how it's going to be. But why did we limit ourselves, Lawson? And is this judgment the holy grail for the next 26 years? Or what else needs to be changed in our democracy and electoral system?
Well, I'm not sure about this being the holy grail for the next 26 years. It's going to be a fundamental change in our electoral system, which, as I said earlier, I think is long overdue. We needed to do this. In fact, the current system was actually only intended to be to apply for the first two elections in 1994 and 1999. Parliament was then obliged to relook at the electoral system and to modify it if necessary. We had the Van Zyl-Slabbert task team in the early 2000s that did exactly that. And in fact, the majority report of that task team proposed a change of the electoral system towards a split between proportional representation and large multi-member constituencies, so that you would have 69 constituencies across the country with several MPs representing each of those elected on a proportional basis. So this has been an issue that has been ongoing for many, many years. Can we move away from representative democracy? I would certainly not want us to do that. I think if one goes back to the Freedom Charter, and South Africa belongs to all who live it, the people all who live in it, and the people shall govern. Well, the people are governing through their elected representatives. What we need to fix in South African politics, and I don't think one can simply fix it through tweaking the electoral system, is to inculcate a culture of accountability, to create mechanisms within political parties so that there's greater levels of democracy inside of political parties, as well as how do we, as ordinary citizens, hold people to account between the 5 yearly times when we go into the polling booth and vote for people. Ours is supposed to be a participatory democracy, not just a representative one. But how do we participate in that decision-making process between elections? That's the key issue I think we need to begin to address.
A very important issue. And I think a lot of people still feel we don't get to choose the ministers. We don't get to choose the president. And then we as the people have to sit with those problems afterwards where there's nothing we can do. We're absolutely powerless in this top-down democracy. I mean, what does it even mean when we talk about the people shall govern? Because we're not governing. It's not working for us. Lawson, what is the role of civil society in the next 2 years and beyond in amplifying people power? I know we're expecting to have public participation. I'm certainly expecting there to be a lot of politicking around that, attempts to influence the public or sectors of the public to participate in particular ways. It's the nature of politics. So I don't know how diluted or tainted this public participation is actually going to be realistically. But what is the role of civil society in the next 2 years and beyond in amplifying people power?
Well, I think, let's look at it from the basis that you've sketched out there, Shabnam. In this process in Parliament, the public consultations, public submissions and the like, the irony of this Constitutional Court judgment is that it is telling Parliament, in other words, the political parties that are in Parliament, those 17 parties I spoke about earlier, who benefit from the current system, is saying to them, you need to change the system. So I think, the role of public submissions is going to be critical in this regard. And I think civil society has an incredibly important role to monitor how political parties behave in this process, and that they stick to the letter and the spirit of the judgment of the Constitutional Court, and that we craft a new electoral system that is more responsive to the needs of ordinary South Africans. And I think that's a role that civil society can play and has played very well. I think we've certainly discovered our voice and our fight in the last 5 years or so, and it's something that I hope civil society will maintain for the next 2 years and for a lot longer after that, because as we know, civil society needs to be the eyes and ears of ordinary South Africans, because not everyone has the time or the resources to maintain that oversight. And civil society bodies play that role, and they're much needed in any democracy, and in particular in ours.
In conclusion, there with Lawson Naidoo, civil society has a very, very important role to play. Thank you very much, Lawson, for spending time with us today on the people's voice and being a defender of our democracy.
Thank you.
We've been in conversation there with Lawson Naidoo, media commentator and constitutional law expert. Thank you very much to him. Thank you also to our audience, our listeners and our viewers. I'll be sharing the video during the course of the week so we can interact more in this very important conversation with Sue Kravitz on abandoned babies, what is to be done, and of course, independent political candidates and the impact on our democracy. Thank you to our listeners and viewers, our guests, Sue Kravitz and Lawson Naidoo, and of course our Salam Media team. And remember to ask yourself every day, what am I doing to make my country and my world a better place? Revolutionary peace. Assalamu alaikum.